All right, we're going to move to the east in our continued discussion about imperialism, and we're going to talk about India. And in India, we're going to be talking about the British and the British making India a British colony. So in this section, we'll talk about the causes and the effects of the Sepoy Rebellion. And if you remember, Sepoy is a term we've talked about before. We'll look at the impact of British rule on India, both positives and negatives. And then we'll look at how the British viewed the Indian people and how the Indian people viewed the British. And finally, at the end, we'll trace the beginnings of Indian nationalism, which will eventually, in the mid 20th century, lead to Indian independence, but it takes a long time to get there. So when we talk about India, we first have to revisit our friends, the Mughals. And remember, the Mughal, very powerful dynasty, Muslim dynasty in the majority Hindu India. Very powerful empire, very wealthy empire. As we've talked about before, by the middle of the 1700s, the Mughal Empire was definitely on its decline for any number of reasons, one of which was a continued lack of strong rulers. What Britain was able to do is turn what initially were commercial interests in this region into political interests and politically gain control of India. So again, a reminder of how the British began their presence in India. As early as the 1600s, the British East India Company. So remember, British East India Company is a private commercial company, has a lot of rights. They can raise a military, they can make agreements, they can basically do what they want. It's not necessarily the British government, but it's a commercial interest driven by economic drivers of the desire to make a profit. So in the 1600s, the British East India Company gains trading rights primarily on the fringe. And if you look at the map, you can see, actually we'll have a better map a little bit later, but you can see primarily on the coasts as early as the 1600s. As the Mughal Empire declines, and here's where you'll see it, the British increasingly gain control to the point where by the middle of the 1800s, the East India Company controls more than half of the territory in India. As we've talked about it the several times we've visited India, it is a land, a territory of great diversity. Britain, as they gained more control, exploited that diversity. India was the home to many cultures, many peoples. Two primary religions, again, are Hinduism is the majority, and Islam. When the empire began to crumble, these groups, be they Hindu or Muslim, were not able to work together to unite, to push out the Europeans, in this case, the British. Britain takes advantage by encouraging competition between the rival princes, again, so that they can't unite in opposition to the British. Now again, the British East India Company's goal was to make money. They were a commercial enterprise. The British policies, even though they were focused on economic accomplishments, they did result in some improvements in India. For example, roads were improved, crime was reduced. The East India Company also pushed for social change that they viewed as not consistent with Western society. For example, ending indentured servitudes. That certainly was something that was happening elsewhere in Britain and the British Empire, so they were looking to end indentured servitude in India. They were not entirely happy with the caste system as well, so they were looking to minimize or get rid of the caste system if possible. Another practice as an example of making societal changes, there's a practice called the sati in the Hindu faith. And the sati basically was the practice where if the husband died and as part of the husband's funeral, and generally in the Hindu faith, those who die are burned as part of the funeral rite, the wife was expected to throw herself on the fire and kill herself as well. This practice was banned by the British East India Company. Now, granted, the British are coming at their policies from a British perspective, but as we'll see, its insensitivity to the local customs of both Muslims and Hindus are going to lead to what is a significant event in Indian history, certainly in the colonial period, that being the Sepoy Rebellion in 1857. Now remember, we talked about Sepoys before. Sepoys were Indian natives. They were soldiers that were hired to fight for the British. The British issued a series of rules in the 1800s that angered the Sepoys and finally pushed them to the point where they felt they had no choice but to take arms against the British. So what were these rules? Well, there's several of them. We're going to highlight three. The first one is Sepoys were required to serve overseas. So even though they were Indian natives, they might be required to serve in Africa or elsewhere in Asia or even anywhere else in the world. Well, the problem was for those Hindus in the high castes, they were not allowed to leave India. So requiring them to travel was against their faith. A second example. East India Company rules allowed the widow of a Hindu to remarry. Well, Sepoys saw this as a violation of traditional Hindu practice and an attempt by the British to Christianize them, and they took offense to that. Probably the most offensive rule change was this last one. So new rifles were issued to the Sepoys in 1857. In order to load the rifles of this time, you had to bite off the end of the cartridge and then load your weapon, load your gun. Now, the cartridges were greased with cow fat or pig fat. Now, whether you're Muslim or Hindu, cows were sacred to Hindus and pigs were forbidden by Muslims. So in biting off the end of this greased cartridge, greased with animal fat, you were, in their minds, requiring them to violate a very strong tenet of their faith. And they resisted doing this. So when Sepoys were ordered to load their rifles and they refused to do it, they were arrested for failing to follow orders, for insubordination. And this was finally the last straw. So as a culmination of these rules, Sepoys together rose up in rebellion against the British, and they attacked both the British military forces that were there, and there weren't many there in the beginning, but those forces, but also went out and attacked British civilians. And you can see here in the northwest provinces, the outline in green, which were the areas of strong Sepoy resistance. Well, in response, Britain sent more troops to India, and the British troops retaliated very aggressively, killing thousands of Indian civilians, but certainly many Sepoys as well. And you can see some of the Sepoys that were captured here being prepared for execution. So the Sepoy Rebellion was significant, and Britain was forced to take a look at what the East India Company was doing in India. So it was at this point, after the Sepoy Rebellion, that the country, the government of Great Britain, took over from the East India Company. So British sent more troops to India, and of course, as we experienced in North America, the Indians were taxed in order to pay for the support of these troops. As you can imagine, among the Indian people, discontent continued, and there's a rising nationalist movement, so India for the Indians, to try to get rid of the British presence. And many historians looking back at the Sepoy Rebellion of 1857 as the first Indian War of Independence. Indians, like many other areas of Asia and Africa, were frustrated and angry at how Britain extracted wealth from India for the benefit of the mother country. So what did the government look like that the British set up in India? So they set up a system of colonial rule. So India is going to become a British colonial territory, so a colony, and they call it the British Raj. And they send an Englishman to rule in the name of the Queen, called the Viceroy. The high officials in the British Raj would be British, and there wouldn't be a significant number of them, but they would be British, and they would hold the high positions. The lower positions they tried to keep among the Indian natives to sort of still give them a say and give them something of a voice, or at least a semblance of a voice. So you can see this is a transition from a more indirect rule that we've talked about before to a little bit more direct, certainly in terms of sending more troops and having an Englishman at the top reporting to the Queen. India, as we go forward, as the British Raj becomes the crown jewel of the British Empire, giving the British crown great wealth, great prestige. And this is going to be one of those colonies that they hold on to as long as they can, again, until the mid-20th century. So what were some of the benefits that the British brought to India? Well, the British bring their legal system, so they revised the legal system of India, promoting more equality, more justice, regardless of which caste you come from. Certainly there was more peace and more order in India than there had been before, more consistency from region to region. Britain also builds infrastructure, so railroads and telegraph lines are installed, making it easier for Indians to travel, make it easier for Indians to communicate. And Indians began to unite between regions as a result of this greater connectivity. It's the upper class Indians that benefit the most because they're the ones who are working more closely with the British. So the upper classes benefit from a British education, so they would go to Oxford, to Cambridge, and then come back to India. And the Indian princes and the landowners are the ones that are going to get wealthy as they're responsible for the Indian production, trade of goods that goes back to Britain for manufacture. Even though there were benefits or changes that benefited India, most of those changes in a greater amount benefited the British. The British, certainly from their perspective, ethnocentric approach to it, felt that they were helping India to modernize, bringing them into the modern time. But the policies certainly favored the British and the British presence. When Britain began to flood India with textiles made in Britain, it ended up ruining the very prosperous, very historically successful Indian hand weaving industry. If you can make goods very inexpensively and undersell the local competition, you're going to do significant damage to the Indian industry. The British also encouraged farmers in India to grow cash crops, so cash crops being crops that can be sold for cash, as opposed to growing food to feed the people. Now, even back in this time, India had one of, if not the largest population anywhere in the world. So this focus on cash crops leads not only to deforestation, so cutting down forests, but also a shortage of food and pretty significant famine, because again, they're focused on growing things like cotton and not growing enough food to feed the people. So if you look at this chart, and this is really amazing, if you look at that period, 1850 to 1875, 5 million people, no insignificant number, die from famine again because of this focus on the cash crops. But then from 1875 to 1890, more than 15 million Indian people die because they don't have enough food to eat. Indians were divided in how they looked at what Britain was doing in their country. The upper class, again, the ones that benefited the most from the British ways, British education, getting wealthy off of trade, they tended to adopt more modern ways. And you can see the polo team here. You have Indians as well as Brits as part of the polo team. But you've got Hindu and Muslim religious leaders that opposed British-style, Western-style modernization. Certainly they favored more traditional ways, focused and based on their religion. One person, significant person who tried to sort of bridge the gap, who recognized the benefits of both. Ram Mohun Roy tried to combine both the old and the new in the early 1800s. He certainly saw value in Western ideas, Western attempts to reform Indian society, but he also recognized the value of Indian culture, and he wanted to preserve that at the same time. He founded a Hindu college which provided an English-style education, but he also saw the need to institute some of the reforms, such as getting rid of the sati, limit the impact of the caste system, minimize or get rid of arranged child marriages. So again, Ram Mohan Roy, bridging the gap, taking the benefits of both, and trying to combine them in a English-style education system. The British were also divided in their attitude toward Indian culture. Certainly, as the British are there for an extended time, they begin to translate English or Indian classics, and they gain respect for the richness of the culture, the religious ideas and the practices, all aspects of Indian culture. So many academics, at least, certainly saw a lot of value in Indian culture. But in a more traditional imperialistic point of view, very European or Eurocentric point of view, English leaders such as this historian Thomas Macaulay didn't think much of basically any other tradition, but certainly Indian traditions. And here's his famous quote. He says, "A single shelf of good European library is worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia." So again, this looking down on Indian culture, thinking that English, British culture, European culture is superior, was very common and probably the majority opinion of the day. If you remember when we talked about direct and indirect rule, and the British approach was that providing the children of the local leaders with a British education, once they went to Cambridge and Oxford and came back to India, they would understand how things works, and they would be more accepting of British culture and certainly the rule of the British in the territory. But really the opposite is what happened. So it wasn't the result that the British intended. So these educated Indians returned back and they heard about democracy and social justice and equality and opportunity, and they said, well, hey, wait a second. Why can't we have those things in India? Why do we have to be governed by a foreign power? So we start to see the beginning, these educated Indians with this Western education come back and begin nationalistic movements. So 1885, we have the Indian National Congress, which meets, again, these are going to be Indian natives, meeting to propose ideas like self-rule, steps toward democracy. And initially, at least, they get very minimal response from the British. It's going to take a while from 1885, but at least initiated in 1885, the Indian National Congress. Now remember, we've got the majority Hindu population and a minority Muslim population. Now the minority Muslim population certainly respects the idea of the Indian National Congress, but they're worried that the majority Hindus are going to dominate any kind of government or any kind of self-rule that might happen as the British give up some power. So we have a Muslim League that is formed in 1906 to represent specifically the interests of the Muslim minority in India. And they begin talking about not only independence from Britain, but also a separate Muslim state. And we'll certainly see that evolve when we get to the middle of the 1900s, and eventually India gets its independence.